Okay, if you have a simple understanding of how federalism works from the first set of notes, we're going to talk about how federalism kind of evolves through Supreme Court decisions and how those decisions impact the interpretation of the Constitution. You heard me use some of these phrases in the previous PowerPoint, but I figure these are terms that you probably need to lock into your vocabulary to definitely understand the types of powers that the Supreme Court will reference in subsequent cases that deal with federalism. So anytime we talk about delegated powers or enumerated powers, these are things that we can directly find in the Constitution that are federal powers, that they are the only ones that they have the ability to do them. The reserved powers is set up by the 10th Amendment, right? These are state power alone. Anything that's not listed in the Constitution, in theory, is a state power. Concurrent powers would be areas where both states have power, so something like taxation would be an example of concurrent powers because they can both tax citizens of the state. And then the last would be prohibited powers, things that neither government can do. So like neither government can create an ex post facto law, neither government can establish a state or federal religion, things that they're explicitly banned from doing. So to set up our next couple of Supreme Court cases, we're going to introduce another clause from the Constitution, and we will connect the dots again between this clause of the Constitution, things like the Elastic Clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the 10th Amendment. The next clause that shows up that is relevant to us is the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause shows up in Article 1, Section 8, and it's Clause 3, and it says, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is a power that Congress has used the Elastic Clause to increase the scope of, right? If we think about what commerce is from a simple definition of the buying and selling of goods, this means that Congress has the ability to regulate buying and selling of goods as long as those practices cross state lines. The definition of commerce gets a lot more complex over time, and the federal government has tried to justify their control of a bunch of different practices through the Commerce Clause as well. So the next case that uses the Commerce Clause and the Elastic Clause that impacts the 10th Amendment is Gibbons versus Ogden. Gibbons versus Ogden was decided in 1824, and the simple way to remember it is that it's the steamboat case. The background of the case is that Ogden received a state license from the state of New York to run a licensed monopoly of steamboat ferries across the Hudson River. If you're not familiar with your geography, the Hudson River is what, runs between New York and New Jersey. So Ogden can go from New York to New Jersey, New Jersey to New York, and because of the state license he has, he is the only one who can do this. Like any other good venture capitalist, Gibbons sees the potential of traffic, sees how much money he can make from this industry, and goes to the federal government to get a license to run a steamboat ferry. Clearly, Ogden is mad because the existence of Gibbons' steamboat ferries violates the monopoly that the state of New York gave him. So Ogden sues Gibbons, saying he's violating the practice of the state license from the state of New York, even though Gibbons has a federal license. If you have a crystal ball or are fairly intuitive, you can probably figure out how this case goes down. Gibbons wins. Gibbons wins because he has a federal license, right? And because the steamboat ferry is running between two states across a river, the federal government is able to use the Commerce Clause to justify their overruling of New York State's license. This makes, again, the national government stronger, which potentially throws the system of federalism out of balance again, and this also sets the precedent where the national government is primarily in charge of nearly all trade law. Again, there's that important phrase with commerce of interstate, meaning it has to cross state lines to regulate it. So we'll look at if there are any other potential cases or issues that might check the federal government's power down the road. There are two final cases that we can connect to federalism and other constitutional clauses where we see everything kind of in play. In 1995, the Supreme Court hands down the landmark decision in United States versus Lopez. Your background decision is that Lopez, who is a high school senior, I think in Texas, takes a gun to school. His argument is that it was concealed, it was not loaded, and he was taking it to school, and he would get paid $44 for, giving the gun to someone else. Regardless of how you think about, Lopez taking a gun to school, right, in theory, he should be allowed to do that unless there were state laws that kind of banned his action. Before this decision comes down, the federal government passed the gun-free school zone law that says you can't have a gun within 1,000 feet of a school. Lopez, right, once it's discovered that he has a gun, he is punished because he is in violation of the gun-free school zone law. Lopez sues the government for, right, believing that he's not in violation of this law or he shouldn't be punished, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And we talked about two very old Supreme Court decisions where the national government's power was expanded because of commerce, because of the Elastic Clause, that kind of stuff. The United States versus Lopez, the decision goes the other way, that the court strikes down the Gun-Free School Zone Act because they do not believe that it has anything to do with commerce. So they don't have the power to make these kinds of laws, because if you look at the 10th Amendment, the national government is not the one in charge of education policy, the states are. So because the Gun-Free School Zone Act and education in general was too much of a stretch for issues of commerce, that's a reason why the Supreme Court overturns it. And this is where we start to see balance start to shift back the other way. We start to see that the states get a little bit more powerful in a world after the Lopez decision, where, right, the federal government now is a little bit more limited in terms of what their definition of commerce is. So this is a kind of a victory for the 10th Amendment and striking that balance between the states and the national government. When we talk about other cases that happen after Lopez, there now becomes a question of whether or not there's a federal justification for an act of commerce. The last case I want to talk about is decided in 2005, and it's the case of Gonzalez versus Raich. Okay, the final Supreme Court case that matters in the context of understanding federalism now is Gonzalez versus Raich. This is a 2005 decision that dealt with medical marijuana in the state of California. So, in terms of the background information you need, in 1970, Congress passes a law called the Controlled Substances Act that gives the government the power to regulate the manufacture, importation, possession, and distribution of certain drugs. This is what gives them the ability to regulate the manufacturing of, like, medicine, right? So, like, FDA approval and stuff like that. But this is also the law that gets used to allow Congress to eventually schedule the possession of illegal drugs as well. In the early 2000s, when the state of California started legalizing marijuana for medicinal use, they had a highly regulatory framework, right? You had to go to a doctor to be prescribed marijuana for a medicinal purpose. You had to go to a licensed, registered, dispensary, and you had to become a member of that dispensary. You could only get the quantity of pot or derivative product that you needed based on your prescription, like any other medicine. Some people started growing their own marijuana, not for distribution, but for medicinal purposes as well, and Raich was one of them. She is sued in the midst of the federal government starting to crack down on California's medical marijuana law, and she makes the argument that Congress has no ability to regulate her growing and consumption of marijuana for two reasons. Number one, she was growing the pot herself and would not sell it, trade it, exchange it for any economic or commerce-based practice with anyone. So number one, she believed that it's not a commerce issue. Number two, her marijuana would not cross state lines, so there would not be a border issue or an interstate commerce issue. So she thought she would win. And in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court finds in favor of Gonzalez, who is the Attorney General for the United States. Raich lost because the federal government can trump state laws that permit medicinal marijuana. Now, this is different from the patchwork of state-based marijuana laws we have today, largely because of some judicial guidance given to the Department of Justice under the Obama administration that the Trump administration has not acted on yet. But in a world where more states are legalizing marijuana, you have a lot of people pointing and looking at the Raich decision and wondering when the federal government will step in and maybe crack down on this practice because it gives them the power to. At the end of this, you should now be able to fill out 3 additional Supreme Court graphic organizers, one on Gibbons versus Ogden, one on Lopez, and one on Gonzalez versus Raich. If you have any other questions, shoot me an email. Thank you.